Welcome to the second of our short series on history of Ukraine and the Ukrainians. My name is Roman Onufrijchuk. In the previous program, we began by talking about the early history. We talked about, rather I talked about, I guess, the coming of Kievska Rus, the creation of the Kiev state, and the civilization that had evolved there over a period of about 200 to 300 years. And we ended on the year 1240, which was the year that the Mongols came and besieged the city of Kiev. And after a long, and it was a very long and bitter siege, they finally entered the city and razed it. With that was the beginning of the end of Kievska Rus, in the sense that a civilization which was characterized by, for example, the times of Queen Olha, hospitals were being built in Kiev, through the work of Cyril and Methodius, who were both from Macedonia, Thessalonica, to be precise. An alphabet came, the Christian church came from Byzantium. Under the rule of Yaroslav, we know that libraries were being built in Ukraine. This high level, or substantial level of civilization, indeed in some ways very advanced for Europe of the time, this civilization began to come apart after the Mongols took Kiev. And while there was a significant period of another 1.5 centuries where the Ukrainians struggled to maintain control of the land, basically with that blow, except for a short period in western Ukraine, in the Lviv Principality, with the exception of that, this was pretty much the end of the Kievan civilization, the Kievan Rus period of Ukrainian history. What this was followed by was an invasion by the Lithuanians. The Lithuanians had been massing themselves as an imperial people, and they began a push into the east and to the south, and ultimately ended up taking most of Ukraine. Russia, what was to become Russia, remained in the hands of the Tartars, and Russian kings would pay money to the Tartars for a long period. But Ukraine, as such, slowly moved over to the rule of, under the rule of the Lithuanians. Lithuanians, interestingly enough, adopted the language of the Ukrainian nobility and adopted the church of the Ukrainian nobility, and in many ways integrated themselves into the society that had already existed prior to their invasion. But they formed a pact over time with Poland, and the two crowns, the crown of Poland and the crown of Lithuania, merged. Now, this was to have very significant consequences for Ukraine, because once that merge had actually taken place, what occurred was that a specifically Western feudal form entered Ukrainian society. It was something that the Ukrainians were totally unprepared for and didn't know how to deal with. And what basically occurred was that Polish nobility, they were called the Szlachta, began to run affairs in Ukraine, and they owned villages. Not only did they own villages, they owned the people and the animals in the villages. If you wanted to get married, you had to get permission from the Lord. If you wanted to leave the village, you had to get permission from the Lord. Quite often, people who weren't Ukrainian were administrators for the Polish nobility. Quite often, these people were Armenians, sometimes they were Jews. The Jewish population of Ukraine grew. In addition to that, the southern lands, the lands which had been at one time the home of nomadic Mongolian peoples, like the Polovetzians, the Pechenegs, these lands now became no man's land, as they were called, because after the coming of the Mongols, slightly later, a group of Tartars settled in what is Crimea today and made Crimea their base of operations. Now, life for the Ukrainian peasant at this time was extremely difficult. The peasant was being exploited by the nobility, and to make matters worse, annually the Tartars raided Ukraine for slaves. And these slave raids, incidentally, were quite significant. In an average raid, 2,000 to 3,000 people were taken to the slave markets in Sinope and on the Black Sea. So the problem became that on the one hand you were being exploited by Polish nobility, on the other hand you were always a potential victim for the slavers who came from the steppe. And what evolved during this period in the mid-1400s, probably much sooner than that, but certainly in historical terms, we know from about the mid-1400s, was a new phenomenon appeared in the steppe. And that phenomenon, in many ways, is like the amplifier of Ukrainian history. It is a period that is so dense in activity and events that truly it is one of the most significant periods in the evolution of the Ukrainian people as such. And this period we call the Cossack period. Now, who were the Cossacks? The first name we have for them was Ukhodniki, which means those who go in. Now, where is in? In is the steppe. The steppe is no man's land. It is a dangerous place, but it is a place that is abundant in game. It is a place abundant in fish. It is a place that's abundant in freedom. And so men began to leave, as fugitives, began to leave their homes and flee into the steppe. And in the steppe, they began to form bands. And these bands, over time, began to elect leaders called otamane. So the otaman was a leader of a band. And the men would go into the steppe in the summer. They would be armed. And as we can see in some of these illustrations, particularly the one just over here, this is a very, very common and popular image. It's probably later than the period that I'm now discussing. But in it we have a character called Kozak Mamai. And the Cossacks become a folk hero of the Ukrainian people. But anyway, these men go into the steppe in the summers, and they fish and they hunt, and they raid the Tartar bands that are moving across the steppe with slaves. And then in the winters, they would go to the garrison forts, places like Bila Tserkva, places like Bila Tserkva, other cities along the perimeter of the open steppe, and they would spend their winters there because winters were considered to be dangerous on the steppe because of increased Tartar activity. The men in charge of the cities began to charge extremely high taxes for the Ukhodniki or the Kozaki to winter in the forts. And as a result, a move was made to actually winter in the steppe. And under the leadership of a governor of one of the border cities, a man by the name of Dmitro Baidavishnovetsky, a fortress was built in the Dnieper River rapid area. Actually, it was just past the rapids. Now, the rapids, of which there were 10 on the Dnipro, these are the Dnieper. These rapids were called the Porohe, which means the door lintels. So the men who became the Cossacks who lived in the Sich fortress and around it in the southern steppe became known as the Zaporozhians, meaning those from beyond the rapids. Now, before I tell you more of their history, I should probably tell you a little bit about their culture. These were men who came from everywhere. They came from villages. They were predominantly Ukrainian, though we know from the rosters that there were men from actually all over Europe at various times in the Cossack Sich, and the Sich meaning the fortress. Now, these men were all free men, and their leaders, called a Hetman, we have an illustration of probably one of the most important Hetman here, who's Bogdan Khmelnytsky. That's him in the far corner, and I'll talk more about him shortly. The Hetman was not somebody who became a Hetman because of what shall we say? It wasn't an inherited position. You had to be elected, and you were elected in free council. And there's a very interesting old tradition that once the Hetman was elected, his mark of state was a mace called a bulava. But once the Hetman was elected, they would put a barrel in the town center in the fortress of the Sich, and they would create mud all around it, and the Cossacks would sit the newly elected Hetman on the barrel, and everybody would come up and put a handful of mud on his head. And the message of that was, we elected you, you are our servant. You are not our king or our leader. Their culture was extremely dynamic. They elected a number of positions. They had a council. Councils were called by the pounding of kettle drums. And they first appear in history as brigands. As a matter of fact, the name Kozak is kind of an ambiguous term because it can mean a friend of the people, a supporter of the people, or it can also mean somebody who is an outlaw of sorts. So the Cossacks appear first time in history. This is the Ukrainian Cossacks, because we should note that Cossackdom is a way of life. It is not limited to Ukraine or the Ukrainians. Cossacks of a similar variety also existed on the Don River, the Don Cossacks as they were known. But we're speaking now of the Ukrainian Cossacks, or the Zaporozhians. They first appear historically in raids, and who they raided was the Ottoman fleets. They would put together these small boats called the Chaika, which means a gull, boats that would be rowed by 20 to 30 men with cannons on front and back. And in large flotillas, they would hit the Black Sea and raid the slave pens of the Tartars and the Turks. And the Turks, incidentally, were the ones who began to complain very actively to the Polish king that we've got this problem with these guys who keep on coming out of this fortress someplace in the Dnieper River and raiding our slave cities, raiding our garrisons, raiding our towns. The Cossacks became so aggressive and so full of confidence that they managed to raid Istanbul today. They managed to raid Istanbul twice taking the port. And incidentally, they were very good strategists because they were competing with very sophisticated military equipment of the Turks. So they had to develop all kinds of strategies using these little small boats. And they would position themselves between, for example, they would get the sun in their rear so that when looking out, the Turks couldn't see them because they'd be looking straight into the sun. Meanwhile, using the sun as a shield, the Cossacks would come right up to the Turkish fleet and from literally point-blank range blast away at the boats right at the waterline, bringing down these large galleys. They were an army that depended on cavalry. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of talk about my saber is my sister, my horse is my brother, and that's all the family I have. When they joined the Brotherhood, because it was a brotherhood, they took an oath, and they were registered in the Brotherhood's books under usually a different name, a nickname. And many names that refer to, for example, names that would mean wind is a very typical Cossack name given to the men when they joined the Brotherhood. They would live at the Sich or in its vicinity. They would sometimes go home and return for campaigns. Now, for the most part, the first real conflict that they are involved in was with either the Turks or the Tartars. And incidentally, a very important part of the story has to do with the way they guarded the frontier. They would build these towers. And atop of these towers, they would put straw that had been soaked with a tar. And two Cossacks would guard one of these towers. And the towers were positioned so that one tower could be seen by another tower, usually on the horizon. And if one of the men on top of the tower saw Tartars coming, he would light the straw, and it would produce a very thick black smoke. The men in the tower, a kilometer or two up the way, would light their straw, and so within minutes, the population knew that the Tartars were coming, looking for slaves. So their first real role, and one of the reasons why the Polish government tolerated them, in fact, well, I mean, for one reason they were tolerated is they were armed, and they were slowly evolving into a significant military force. But certainly one of the reasons why they were tolerated was because they guarded the frontier. They guarded the frontier from the raids of the slavers. But this tolerance would not last forever, and in fact this tolerance would fall apart into what proved to be ultimately a full-out rebellion of the Ukrainian Cossacks against their Polish noble overlords. This begins slowly. This begins quite slowly. At first, especially some of the very enlightened Hetman, or leaders of the Cossacks, sought to develop a good relationship with the Polish crown. And they would do this to enable themselves to register more and more Cossacks. And registered Cossacks, as compared to the Zaporozhians, were actually paid by the crown. Probably one of the significant Hetman of this kind was Petro Konashevich Sahaydachny. Sahaydachny was an educated man for his time. He was a brilliant military commander. He was also extremely demanding as an officer. The troops had a lot of respect for him. And he, on a number of occasions, actually saved Polish garrisons from the Ottoman Turks, thereby gaining a great deal of favor with the Polish crown. He was also central in the period when, because the Poles ruled, the Ukrainian nobility and burghers were quite heavily oppressed. And this was mainly because they were of the Orthodox Church. Now, the Poles had begun putting on pressure to move the Ukrainian population into the Catholic Church. And so a number of Ukrainian clerics, thinking that the best possible solution would be to enter into an act of union with the Roman Catholic Church, that if they did this, they would preserve Ukrainian nobility and Ukrainian city dwellers from total assimilation into the Polish people and into the Polish ruling elite. And so an act of union was signed in 1595, where many Ukrainian Orthodox priests and bishops entered into what became the Ukrainian Catholic Church, or the Ukrainian Union Church. And there was a great deal of oppression against the Orthodox, and the church itself, it looked like, would disappear, except that Sahaidatchny besieged the Kiev monastery, surrounded it with his troops facing outward, and having brought clerics from Greece and other Orthodox countries, he renewed the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. So he was a great hero for the Orthodox Church and a great defender of the Church. But Sahaidatchny, what we should note, not so much about Sahaidatchny, but again returning to the culture of the Cossacks, while it was extremely dynamic, what we should know is that it could also be anarchistic. And if a hetman or a ruler, a leader, didn't fulfill the wishes of the Free Brotherhood, it was quite often that he was either set aside, sometimes he was even executed for not fulfilling the wishes of the Brotherhood. In any event, Sahaidatchny had curried favor with the Polish crown, but tensions grew increasingly between the crown and the Free Brotherhood. And the Free Brotherhood continued to grow. Of course, it wasn't lost on the crown nor the nobility that quite often the men who fought as the Cossacks were quite often fugitives from villages where they had been serfs, owned by nobility. In any event, the Cossacks also played a role in the Polish Commonwealth in the sense that they were used as mercenaries, and they fought as far afield as France, to be precise. When the Ottoman Turks besieged Vienna, it was Ukrainian Cossacks who, under the leadership of the Polish crown, raised that siege. The most popular image of them are free men on horseback, though we know from our discussions with historians that, in fact, they tended to fight on foot. They were early innovators in trench warfare. They would ride to battle on horseback, but in fact they would, for the most part, operate as infantry. They developed a whole mass of what I think we can call guerrilla tactics. A popular one was to bury your artillery, flee so that the enemy thought that you were giving flight, agree where you would meet, so what looked like a haphazard retreat would in fact be a trap. And once you got to a certain way away from where you were escaping, you'd reform into a complete company and meet the enemy head on, which was totally unprepared for this. You'd bury your artillery, dig it up later, use it again. As a matter of fact, last time I was in Ukraine, I was told a joke where a child says, "Daddy, Daddy, don't pour oil on the flowers, you're going to kill them." And the father answers, "That's okay, son, but the weapons won't get rusty." So this idea of burning your weapons till you need them again became a theme that developed in this Cossack period, and it was a theme that would remain with the Ukrainians right up into the present for reasons that we will see as history unfolds. In any event, as the 1600s began to unfold, tensions grew between the crown and the Cossacks, and a series of rebellions took place. Those rebellions became increasingly violent, and the crown became increasingly cruel and excessive in the way it put down these rebellions. And you know, what one has to grasp here is you're not dealing with just a bunch of guys with kitchen knives. You're dealing with hundreds of thousands of men who are armed, who are disciplined, who are, for all effects and purposes, a democratic people's army. Now, that is handy sometimes for the crown, be it first the Polish one or later the Russian one, because it's possible to manipulate a group like that. But they are democratic, and when they start seeing their brethren getting slaughtered, especially when in a previous rebellion, the Poles put both men, women, and children to the sword after those people had surrendered. The tension that was growing very, very strongly. And in 1648, that tension finally broke. And in 1648, what came to pass was that Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who himself was of a Ukrainian noble family, and was a man whose early career was really not characterized by anything outstanding. Suddenly Khmelnytsky, for a number of reasons, one of which was that lands that belonged to him were appropriated by a Polish nobleman.
who also managed to appropriate a woman that Khmelnytsky planned to marry. So, you know, the matters get complicated here. Something snapped, and Khmelnytsky emerges out of the Cossack Brotherhood as a man capable of capturing the imagination of an entire nation, an entire age. He declares, not declares, but openly defies the king, and he rebels against the nobility. And what follows is a sequence of very dramatic battles, Zhovki Vody being one of them, and so on, where Khmelnytsky's so-called People's Army demonstrates its incredible power in overwhelming trained Polish military forces. But what is even more significant, in this revolution of Khmelnytsky's, the peasant masses, if you want to call them that, the peasants joined him. And what you had in effect was a massive popular revolution against feudalism and against the nobility. Now, Khmelnytsky unfortunately realized that his emphasis, at least the emphasis of his army, was on infantry. He needed cavalry. And so he entered into an agreement with the Khan of the Crimean Tartars. And this proved to be both good and bad. It proved to be good at the beginning because it gave him the kind of wallop that he needed to meet the heavy Polish cavalry. But especially in Berestechko, and we've spoken about the treasures of Berestechko, in Berestechko this actually cost him, because what the Poles did was they had secretly bought the Khan themselves. And at the Battle of Berestechko, the Crimean Tartars took Khmelnytsky, the leader, captive and made off with him, putting the Ukrainian army into disarray and causing the massacre that took place at Berestechko. So this thing about looking for, Khmelnytsky was looking for someone who could help him finally break the hold of Polish nobility on Ukraine. In any event, the first revolution went extremely well, and the Ukrainian army found itself on the borders of Poland. The Poles began to sue for peace. Khmelnytsky accepted. One of the conditions of peace was the disarmament of the peasants. This proved in many ways to be Khmelnytsky's undoing. Khmelnytsky agreed to the truce. The Ukrainian army pulled back. The peasants were disarmed, or they began disarming the peasants, and the Poles invaded again. And what evolved then was an ongoing struggle which began to look more and more like a war of attrition between the Polish nobility and the Ukrainian Cossacks. In many ways, this so weakened the Polish state that in the near future, or shortly after the Revolution of 1648, a period of extreme troubles for Poland began, a period called the Deluge, which had a lot to do with the amount of resources they need to put into keeping the Ukrainian Cossacks in line. Well, 1648, that didn't end the revolt. And in 1654, Khmelnytsky, looking for assistance, looking for someone he could trust to help him in the struggle with Poland, turned his attention to the Tsar of Muscovy. And in 1654, an agreement was arrived at called the Pereyaslav Agreement. It took place during the Pereyaslav Council. It's a city not far from Kiev, off to the south and the east. And in the city, what was agreed, we will never really know, because the original document of the Pereyaslav Agreement disappeared. And while it had existed, it was being changed almost annually by the Russian Tsars. But what this did was, in 1654, it threw Russian army into Ukraine, which, in addition to the Ukrainian army, now successfully managed to push the nobility out of what we call the western part of Ukraine, or what we call if you stand looking down the Dnieper, the western part is the right hand, so it's the right bank Ukraine. So the Polish nobility gets pushed out of right bank Ukraine, but it is at that time that the Russians make their first real appearance in Ukraine. And in my next program, I will explain what that came to mean, especially after the Battle of Poltava in 1709 and the destruction of the Cossack army and fortress in 1775. But the upshot of this council and the agreement in 1654 was that for a period of time, left bank Ukraine, or the eastern part of Ukraine, will be ruled by the Cossacks, who slowly evolved from a democratic people's army into two classes. One class called the Starshina, or the officerial class, And another class, the holota, the ones whose name basically means those who are naked, but those who were poor, who didn't have properties. The starshina forms a class which governs, and for a period of about 1654 through 1775, or say 1750, so for about 100 years, the starshina will actually rule a part of Ukraine which we will call the Hetmanate, and we'll talk about that later. The steppe remains no man's land with the Zaporozhian Cossacks on it. The Hetmanate is run by registered Cossacks, and we will see that on the western part of Ukraine, the Poles will make a return, the Polish nobility. But more about that in our next program.